Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio.
Welcome, dear friends, to Kardec Radio and the Health and Spirituality program. We have kickstarted last week a new series. It's Blessed America, yes. For those who think, all the world, will show to you the world is getting better. And there are people making it happen. Yes, Blessed America is a new series in health and spirituality where I'll be talking with renowned thinkers, researchers that are working hard to bridge spirituality and health. They are pioneers in their fields, and they're here with us to share much. And today we have so much to share because we have our dear friend, renowned scientist, Dr. Stephen Post. Yes, he's a book writer. Oh, who he is? Okay, you want to know more? I know. I'll tell you more. If you go to stephenpost.com, you'll find everything about him, his research, his books, but I'll summarize it to you. Yes, he's the best-selling author of that book you've heard about, Why Good Things Happen to Good People, How to Live a Longer, Happier, Healthier Life by the Simple Act of Giving. It's no longer a popular experience, like people feel it, they think of it, or it's set on stone. You do the good things will come your way. He is professor of preventive medicine and bioethics at Stony Brook University. He's a director and founder of the Center for Medical Humanities, Compassionate Care at Stony Brook University. He's a member of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, the New York Academy of Medicine, the Royal Society of Medicine in London. He's the president of the Institute for Research on Unlimited Love, which is doing fantastic works. And he has been the recipient of many awards, like the Distinguished Service Award from the National Alzheimer's Association, etc., etc. If you want to see the full bio, stephenpost.com. Easy site. I know you want to see him. We want to see him. We want to hear from him. We want to talk with him. Feel free to ask your questions if that's the case. Dr. Post, welcome to Kardec Radio once again. How are you?
I'm very well, Vanessa. It is always very special to be on with you because you have so much energy and authenticity. So I thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Dr. Post. You know, you have so much to share that it's always hard to know where to begin. How about if we begin with the science of good and then march towards your latest book? Yes. You want to talk to people about it?
It's good to be good. And science says it's so. This is something that the Institute really kicked off in the late 1990s when there wasn't much research on this topic. But now, of course, it's very commonplace. And we did all kinds of wonderful things, some of them biological, some of them psychological and sociological, just showing that in general, with some exceptions in dysfunctional environments, people who are generous and kind and who contribute meaningfully to the lives of others thrive and flourish. And they do so for a whole lot of different reasons. But absolutely, that's the case. And the cynical view, well, I don't do nothing for nothing. That's unfortunate because it prevents people from realizing that the benefits that accumulate are so much internal. They're really in your metabolism, they're in your brain, they're in your psychological well-being, and they don't depend on reciprocal actions. They're just intrinsic to tapping into this aspect of the human self. But human beings are not, all that perfect. If you read the newspapers, we are a mixed bag, and some pretty terrible things happen quite commonly. And so I do believe that this is where spirituality becomes important. We've studied spirituality quite extensively, and it is the case that when we connect with some higher spiritual principle in the universe, it brings out the very best within us, because that is also uh, a part of our own inward soul, if you want to put it in those terms. And so by spirituality, we can ensure that we live by the rule of love, the law of love, and we do it in a wiser, more effective, more enduring, more inclusive way than we might otherwise in our sort of human myopia.
Yes, human myopia. I love it. But the research you've done on the It's Good to Be Good project, there is an annual report that you update, right? And it
Yes.
was sponsored by the Institute for Research on Unlimited Love. You want to tell
Yes.
us more about it?
Well, yeah. I mean, we can always continue on that. We've done national surveys. That's one technique. There are so many different methods, but national surveys uh, of adult Americans from coast to coast, asking them what their self-reported health benefits were when they were involved in volunteering and helping others. It turns out that in one survey, um, and this was done way back in early 2010,
Mhm.
looking at the year 2009, seems so long ago now, but basically 41% of Americans were volunteering, on average maybe 100 hours a year. And if you were to break that down, it could be a couple of hours a week. Um, and what they were reporting, and we asked questions, was, well, okay, so do you feel physically healthier? Maybe 70% said yes. Do you feel happier? About 90%. Do you feel more resilient? Maybe 95%. And do you feel uh, that you have more meaningful friendships and relationships? Similar kinds of numbers. And so if you could look at all of this and put it into a pill that you could pick up at the pharmacy, it would be worth $1 million, because there is no pill that can even come close to this. There's something about our evolved human nature that uh, gears us toward helpful behavior. It's also, you can, whether you're reading Picasso or Shakespeare, what do they say the purpose of life is? The purpose of life is to discover your callings, the gifts that you have that you can use to contribute to the lives of others. And that's really the sort of the purpose of life in so many different philosophies. And people who can connect, can find and follow their callings, will have happier and healthier and longer lives. So it's very important that we use our gifts not just for ourselves, but to serve others. That's really the difference maker. Um,
Yes.
and you do that, in your radio work and with the spiritists and so forth. Um, and this even holds true in grade schools. I mean, we funded some studies of first and second graders in Baltimore once upon a time, and when they were taught to meditate and be mindful and forgiving, they had exercises, role-playing exercises. When they learned to be kind to one another, they did much better in school. The violence stopped, and they became better students. And I noticed the same thing in medical schools, that when you have people who come in here, and they are really devoted to solving a problem, maybe something that affected their parents or their grandparents or a friend, if they have that sort of passion, they'll typically do better. So if you study for yourself, you might do okay, but if you can figure out the secret, which is to study with an eye toward what you can do to help others, you'll be more successful.
Quite interesting. I know in at Emory University, Friends the Wall has this book about the nature of kindness in us. He studied in primates.
Yeah,
So as you're saying, like it's our biological nature.
yeah. Well, we funded Franz de Waal. He was at Emory at the time at the at his primatology institute, and that was when he was really making gains on this point. He was writing books like The Ape Within. See, if you go back to when I was a boy, which is a while now, okay, and if we were going to talk about primatology,
Yeah.
non-human primates, it was all about how non-human primates are real swashbucklers. They're just nasty, brutal, at each other's throats. Life is short. And there was a book which I read, I think, in the 10th grade called "The Territorial Imperative" by an anthropologist named Robert Audrey. And if you read that book, you lost confidence in human nature because you think, well, we evolved in this struggle for survival. So it's always me against you for some desirable object in the environment that we both are looking for. But actually, that view of evolution is, first of all, not even true to Darwin, uh, uh, because Darwin, in his second major book, The Descent of Man, he pointed out that a lot of evolution occurs in groups. And when you're in groups, Group A is going to survive better than Group B to the degree that members in Group A are caring for one another, helping one another when they're ill, when they're frail, when they need help, and so that is called group selection theory. It's in contrast to individual selection theory. And so Darwin realized that while there was this idea of the survival of the fittest individually, there was also this idea of the survival of the fittest as a community of care.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
and so Franz was so correct about that, and what he did was he took this idea of group selection theory and this idea of really observing non-human primates and noticing how much empathy and compassion is involved there. Jane Goodall would be another very important
Mm-hmm.
pioneer of this view because she was actually living with the non-human primates, and she could detail in very explicit ways all their expressions of care for the neighbor. So this is I think in general 20th century science and philosophy, whether you're reading The Territorial Imperative, whether you're reading uh, Dawkins, the selfish gene, whether you're reading a philosopher like Jean-Paul Sartre in Being and Nothingness, where he says in the section on the look that anybody who even glances at you with kindness or a smile is just after your pocketbook. And so it was total one-sidedness with
Mm-hmm.
regard to you. Now there are two sides to human nature. There's a
Yes.
generous, kind, contributing side, and then there's this other side of it. And the Buddhists, they point out it depends on what side we feed. But even in terms of you have a daughter, children, what's going on with a toddler, with a 1-year-old, with an 18-month-old? Well, when we started our research, the assumption was that all these kids were basically at each other's throats, even from the time they were literally knee-high to a grasshopper. And so one of the groups we funded was the Yale University Child Studies Center. Jim Swain was the PI there, and basically they were discovering that, in fact, Rousseau was correct. When Rousseau said that actually the young child is tremendously benevolent
Sure.
and tremendously empathic, and the problem is that we push the wrong buttons. We give them bad role models. We scream at them. We do all the wrong things, and so we inhibit their natural goodness. I think there's a lot of truth to that view, and so however you look at it, uh, the 20th century was the century of relative cynicism, and our century, with the help of science, has completely rejuvenated the view of human nature. Not to be naive about it,
No.
because you can't be. I mean, just go out and look at what's happening in the streets. These
Yes.
horrific events that are on the front page of the New York Post regularly. So we're pushing a lot of the wrong buttons. But in general, there's something very wonderful, and the potentiality of human nature is very, very high. But especially when coupled with spirituality, and that's where the spiritists are important.
Yes. Exactly. There is enough research pointing to that direction, and I'm so happy to see the Institute sponsoring so many beautiful and important research that can define lives on Earth. And talking about it, before we go to the latest book you've written, when I talk about, since you're talking about children, uh, and you have been doing research over the last decades, have you seen changes in terms of the new generations being more prone to doing the good?
Isn't that an interesting question? And it's a hard one to answer.
Mm.
But in my humble opinion, despite the various atrocities that go on and the almost unimaginably destructive activities that occur when people join into marauding gangs and so forth. I mean, they'll kick a frail older adult to death on the sidewalk. I mean, this is, but I think that's a superficial perspective, because I find, I've been teaching in medical schools now, 20 years at Case Western, 14 years at Stony Brook, a long time. And I noticed that the medical students now really are kinder, and they're much more sensitive to um, the social determinants of illness, and they want to reach out and be active in communities. They're not just thinking of themselves. They're really quite authentic and quite magnificent to behold. They're all going into debt, of course, too, and it's not like they're going to make a lot of money, because most of them are now employees. They're not on their own. So they're salaried, and that imposes limits. So it's not the easiest thing. It's a relatively sacrificial area. They'll still get decent salary over the course of the years, but for sure there's a lot of incredible generosity and spirituality in this in this generation. So I'm impressed, very impressed.
That's wonderful. These are wonderful news for everyone who is here. Now let's talk about the other side of the spectrum. When people get older, you people are fragile like babies, and they need help, they need compassion, and they need a dignified way of living and also dying. And you have been contributing so much to the field of understanding these aspects related to Alzheimer's disease and much more. And in the latest book, and I'll mention this, if people go to stephenpost.com, you can find the latest book, Dignity for Deeply Forgetful People. It's interesting. Sorry to extend my comment and question. Near home, near our Spiritist Center and Cardiac Radio, we have a assisted living for people who have memory issues. And our community at the Spiritist out of Virginia every year goes there to sing the Christmas carols, to talk with them, to present a play. And it reminds me so much of your book, the need of
Oh,
making those moments
yeah, yeah,
special.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I'll respond to that very happily. By the way, my website is Stephen G. Post.
Yeah,
The G, just FYI, it's in a PH, but the book came out about 10 or 11 months ago. It's done nicely. It's with Johns Hopkins University Press. And you gratefully mentioned the title, Dignity for Deeply Forgetful People. You notice it's not a book about dementia. Notice that right away. I mean, in other words, I've been involved in this field for the better part of 45 years, and I've never felt very comfortable referring to anybody as demented, because it's a purely negative term. It's very similar to the word retard.
Yeah.
You don't hear people referred to as retarded. You
No.
might call them differently abled, or in some, there's a different language game.
Mhm.
And so dementia is literally a decline from a former mental state, dementia. And we need an alternative. And so to be deeply forgetful is not to have a sort of a them being demented and us being undemented. It's sort of them versus us mentality. I mean, we all have our struggles with memory, especially as we get a little older. Um, and that's perfectly normal. Uh, so I'm one of these people who thinks we need inclusive language and dignity for deeply forgetful people. Deep forgetfulness is almost a mystical term. You can read some of the great mystical writings. I don't know if Karnak wrote about this, but there's something to say for this, because when you go to this memory disorders center in Virginia, these are people who are kind of lost the temporal chronological glue between past and present and future. And so their linear rationality, their ability to operationalize plans projected into the future, that's very limited. And the Nazis in the 1920s called them life unworthy of life, or useless eaters, because they couldn't carry out tasks in the normal sense. But actually, when you're around these people, if you just put that thinking on the shelf, I call it hypercognitive,
Mhm.
just
Mhm.
put that on the shelf and just be with them. They still have symbolic rationality. They can still respond to a symbol that was meaningful to them earlier in life. They can still connect with music that was valued by them once upon a time. They can still connect with a poem. They can still connect with even smells of things that were meaningful to them in younger days. So if you decide to notice these hints at continuing self-identity, that's a great thing, and it makes for community, and we include these individuals. That's what you want. So deeply forgetful is not like dementia. What dementia can brings out negative metaphors: gone, husk, shell, empty, dead, and so forth. Deep forgetfulness provides more continuity and inclusiveness with the human experience. And I mean, I sometimes forget where my car is parked behind this medical
Oh,
school, and I'll ask a student, where my car is parked? And then one time, I couldn't even remember if I'd driven to work. So I said, "Do you know if I drove to work today?" They laughed. They just laughed. They thought I was losing it. But we have those moments.
we do. Yeah.
And so I want something more inclusive, and and also when you're with these individuals, everyone in spirituality, they talk about living in the now, right? And that's
Mindfulness.
something looks well. When you're around someone who's deeply forgetful, you have to live in the now.
Yeah.
You don't have any choice, because you have to put all of that on the side, all of your chronological anxieties. I have to be here, I have to be there. Just drop all that, because you can make a connection right now in the moment. And that's what a lot of spirituality is. It's about getting beyond place and time, and just connecting and being one. And these people still have consciousness.
Of course.
Perfectly. Yeah. So I just to finish this up. So I went to India. I have this on my bulletin board here. In 2015, to Bangalore, which is a beautiful city, and that's where they have the Indian Institute for Advanced Studies. And I was leading a conference on the deeply forgetful. And I was saying, we in the West, we so emphasize linear rationality and functionality and economic vitality, we dismiss people who cannot live at that level, but they still have symbolic rationality. So I talked about a guy I know or knew in Cleveland who worked in the country in the steel mills, and he always dressed country and western. But even to the day of his death with Alzheimer's, he clung to his cowboy hat because somehow he sort of knew that his identity was wrapped up with that. And so simple point is we need to have a language that is much more encouraging and embracing, and that teaches people to do just what you are doing with your spiritist group. Going into these settings, wanting to connect, wanting to notice, wanting to look, and be inclusive, and that's what you do so well.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm looking at the table of contents of the book for those who are watching us. It's fascinating to see when you talk about the caregiver's ethical purpose, and when you talk about the circle of care, the 10 manifestations. And I am highlighting this because after almost 3 years of the COVID pandemic, our healthcare system in general is recovering, right? And we think that we're done, but now it's the aftermath. Many illnesses that came to place due to COVID. And when we talk about caregiving, healthcare, the question is always like, who takes care of the caregivers,
Right.
right?
Yes.
You want to make a comment
Well,
on this?
well, so I broke into the field of caregiving by providing respite support one day a week in Cleveland for family caregivers. And we actually did studies, not through the Institute, but through Case Western, of what the benefits of respite were. That just means that for, say, an afternoon, I would go into somebody's home at their invitation, and they would be able to go out to a restaurant, go shopping, go to a movie, just get together with an old friend and talk about things that are important to them. And if you just have 4 hours of that once a week, there is a slightly elevated depression rate among caregivers. It's not an easy thing psychologically, but that goes right down to baseline if they get respite care at that level. So we actually had a big march on Washington. This is a long time ago. And we wanted the Congress to provide respite care support for caregivers with Alzheimer's. And we had all this data, and it looked pretty good. And so after a meeting, we went up to the offices of these senators and congressmen with candles and so forth. It's a candlelight vigil. And we asked them if they could focus on this. And they said pretty much no, because if they supported caregivers in the Alzheimer's world, they'd have to support caregivers across the board.
Yeah.
And so we do, in American medicine, you're talking about the healthcare systems. I mean, we do everything and anything to keep somebody alive. I mean, the intensive care units, I'm a Clevelander. You walk through Cleveland, you look up at the clinic and so forth. It's like floors and floors of intensive care units. We'll put a tube in every orifice, natural and unnatural, just to keep somebody alive. And we do relatively little compared to, and I don't want to idealize Canada by any means, but we do relatively little compared to many countries to support long-term care. And that's a real problem. So we put a terrific strain on families. They sometimes have to spend down, into relative poverty. I guess when they have about $20,000 left in all of their accounts and even in their value of their home, then they can finally qualify for Medicaid support. It's imbalanced. So I think we need to recognize this. The Canadians are very good. They have publicly funded nursing homes, hospice care for everybody who needs it. But on the other hand, they're doing, at least in Montreal and Quebec, they're doing a lot of preemptive assisted suicide for people who are deeply forgetful. So that's a whole another side of it. Um,
Mhm.
but but in general, sure. I mean, I think respite and working with the caregivers is important. And this book is written, as you can tell, for caregivers. It's written for anybody who's interested in the topic.
Mhm.
But the subtitle is How Caregivers Can Meet the Challenges of Alzheimer's Disease, because they're the heart of it all. They're the wonderful people who make this world work,
Mhm.
and oftentimes underpaid or undersupported. And one story, I went out to Mount Vernon, Ohio. This is in the book, with Joe Foley, the famous neurologist who was my mentor. We went to Geriatric Psychiatric Institute, and there was a section of the building that was devoted to people with the dual diagnosis of Down syndrome plus Alzheimer's disease, which occurs when they get into their 50s. And there were these incredible helpers there. They were Hindu, they were nurses' aides, and they were probably getting paid, $12 an hour at most. And they were so loving and so kind and so generous. And we were so impressed. So Joe and I took a few of them out to a pizza restaurant uh, in Gambier, Ohio, and we asked them, "Why are you doing? Why? How can you do this? It's so beautiful." And they said, "Namaste,"
Oh,
which means in
yeah.
Hindu, it's a greeting. It's not just hi, how are you, what's going on. It's I honor the divine in you, and so they see that there's within each of us some small drop of this eternal, universal one mind, which I think Kardec believed in
Oh,
and
yes.
experienced, and you spiritualists understand. I'm a one mind thinker myself, and I know that. So when you see someone who's deeply forgetful, you can say, "Oh, they're gone," but they're not gone.
No. I understand it from a spiritual perspective because we look at the spirit that is connected to the body. It's like a baby as well. We are like, we know that the body cannot respond, but the spirit is responding. So, I mean, we have to amplify our perception. We're talking about beyond, the physical. That's
Yeah.
another story, right?
But it's an important story because it's the basis of caring and ethics. Um, mind, spirit, very similar concepts, are not just derived from matter. They're different. They're completely different. And many of the better philosophers of mind living today would argue that they just cannot see how you can get from cells, tissue, and so forth to something so different from that as mind. And so
Yes.
that's why the Spiritist tradition, but many of these great traditions, Hinduism certainly, say mind before matter.
Yes.
That matter is just a manifestation of mind. And of what mind? Of the original one mind that beyond time and place is the origin of the universe, the origin of the Big Bang. And so that one mind underlies all of reality. It is ultimate reality. And we, each of us, have a small um, touch of that within us. And that's why we can have premonitions, we can
Mhm.
have creative dreams. That's why we can feel this remarkable oneness with other
Exactly.
people that goes way beyond biology.
Yes.
So that is really essential. And for people who are deeply forgetful, so I have a friend he's an African American pastor of great distinction, and he's originally from Detroit, and his sister died of Alzheimer's about a year ago. We were talking on our cell phones, and I said, Pastor, um, you've been with your sister in these last couple of weeks. What's your take? Was she gone? Was she dead? Was she a husk? And he said, no, actually, I noticed certain things in her of a spiritual quality. And my own perspective is that even though she couldn't communicate, she'd already gone down to the Amtrak station
Mm.
and she had one foot on that blessed train bound for glory.
No.
So she was ahead of us, not, and he had that insight, which I thought was very powerful.
Yes. It's very interesting. You're talking about interdependence, something that you write in this book, versus self-reliance.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, you talk to people when they are aging, and how many of them told me, I'm not going to depend on my children. I'm going to do it all by myself. I don't need anyone. And I'm like, it doesn't exist, right? We are fundamentally interdependent. You talk about it in the book. The caregiver
Yeah.
and the person, the patient, both, they are depending on each other.
Absolutely. So we are so vulnerable. We pretend that we're not. We spend
Yes.
most of our lives figuring out, I'm not vulnerable. I'm not frail. But in fact, when you look at it, when we come into this life, you're a mom, more than any other species on the planet, we are totally dependent for long periods of time. And then if we fall ill, if we have a back injury or whatever it might be, we're totally dependent again. So we are frail, we are vulnerable, and we are dependent. And I think the problem is that our whole system of organization of justice, of healthcare, it's more or less assumes that we are independent and invulnerable. But that's untrue. It's just not true. And so this is why people who spend time looking after individuals in assisted living and so forth, well, they're getting a little better now, minimum wage, but it's been difficult for them because the work they do is so important, but we don't pay for it much, and yet we'll do anything to build new weapons. I'm sorry to say this, but I have to mention it. We'll do anything
Yeah.
to build a new intensive care unit. And by the way, in every hospital I've been in,
Mhm.
the medical students are so disappointed when they go up to the ICU in their clerkships and they see people who are, profoundly, deeply forgetful and in the end stages of Alzheimer's. I mean, those people don't even belong there. They belong elsewhere. They belong in different institutions, but they get caught up in the momentum of the technology and of the legal technology of uh, advanced directives and all of that. But basically, I think that we have to address this. And respite care is something that should be supported, and that should be at the very center of a just society, not some of these other things that we throw so much money at, but that doesn't really do too much good.
Yeah. Wow. I love when you wrote, dependence constitutes the deepest core of human experience, even when we pretend that we are self made. I mean, I don't think we realize it enough. Even children, they start growing up a little more and they're like, it's natural. Of course, it's very, very positive when they say, let me do it. I can do it. It's wonderful. But then you become teens and you forget that you
No,
still depend on people in society. You're
yeah,
not free, right?
that's right. We are very dependent. And of course, on when we die, uh, especially if we have some sort of chronic progressive illness, our dependence is near total eventually. And a lot of people, by the way, will they deny this, and they want to get an opportunity for preemptive assisted suicide, not so much because they don't want to live, but because they don't want to put a burden on their family or on others. They don't want to be a burden. And I
Mm.
can understand that. I'm not critical of anybody for thinking that way, but in the final analysis, there's a certain advantage. I mean, my grandmother had Alzheimer's disease. This is way, way back before they used the words. You heard the term senile dementia
Yes.
or squirrely.
Mm-hmm.
So she was in a nursing home. She was a brilliant woman. She was actually a very famous writer, and uh, and I was pretty close to her. And I would go into this nursing home, and she had lost the ability to feed herself, so she relied on assisted oral feeding. This was before there were any feeding pegs, which I totally disagree with ethically, by the way.
Oh,
I think let people go out, give them assisted oral feeding, but their GI system naturally shuts down, and
yeah.
it's not painful, and just you know keep their orifice um, soft with water and a sponge, and they're fine. I mean, hospice care for these individuals can be quite smooth.
Mm-hmm.
But I would do assisted oral feeding with Grandma Post, and that meant applesauce, a little bit of bran and so forth, and a spoon, and it wasn't always the cleanliest thing. You could get some stuff
Yeah.
spit
Mess.
at you a little bit, but it was so meaningful in terms of connection, because I could notice um, moments when she really kind of came back into herself. I could see a spark in her eye, and then totally surprisingly, and this was not uncommon, she would call me by name when I was doing
Oh,
this. And
wow.
so, and generally she couldn't, but these are episodes of insight and lucidity. And I would ask myself, even as a pretty young person back then, so what does this mean? Does this mean that it's just some little neurological fragment firing off, and don't take it seriously, or does it just mean that underneath this breakdown in communication and this decline, that she's still there? And so I'm on the still there side, and so I was interacting with her in meaningful ways, and if I read, she was from Sheffield, England. If I read a poem to her with some energy, um, something that she would identify with, um, surprisingly, she would become pensive, and then she might even chime in for a line or two, or sometimes even a whole verse.
Oh,
So
wow.
there was more there than met the eye, and that's how you have to think. You have to go the extra mile, and don't dismiss these individuals because their linear rationality is compromised, but view them as fully human and as fully part of the human family,
Hmm.
even though they're deeply forgetful.
That's beautiful. I know science is not here yet to tell us about the other end of the spectrum, but we spiritists understand that the spirit is perceiving everything, the soul that is connected to the body. So it's so important to make people feel that they are them, even if they cannot express it any
Yes,
longer, right?
absolutely. And this is where, actually the Spiritist tradition is quite interesting, and Kardec is quite interesting. What is memory?
Hey, what is memory?
What is memory? So the materialists will tell you that memory is just something that goes on in the material brain. But actually, no one's ever shown how that could possibly work. How could you get all these vistas and conjure up memories of beautiful ocean waves? There's something more to it than matter. You can learn habits. You can take a mouse and
Yeah.
help them get through a maze a little better with that kind of an attitude. But a human being can just, I mean, memory is a miracle. And so
Yeah.
there have been many people who would say, here's an analogy, because a lot of people listening to you today, um, they're at their desks and they have computers, right?
Yes.
So in your desktop computer here, which I have on my left,
Mhm.
there's a certain amount of RAM. I mean, there's room for memory. You can remember a certain amount of stuff, but most of the memory is not in that little contraption on my desk, that little material contraption. It's in the cloud. It's
Yeah.
in the cloud,
Yeah.
and this is what the Spiritist tradition understands, is that actually the idea of the Akashic memory, that somehow your memory, and this is
Yes.
Theosophy and Buddhism and Hinduism, that your memories don't go away, that they're included in this universal mind, the Akashic memory, and uh, and so we need to think of memory in a much deeper metaphysical sense. And so, in that regard, we're always here. We may lose capacity. There are many things that, neurological functions that can get lost. But underneath it all, um, we're not gone.
No,
We're never gone.
never gone. And it's so important to establish a relationship that is conscious. So when we are talking about our relationship with those who are deeply forgetful, to understand, I remember last year at Christmas when we were talking to some of them at this um, nursing home, and that lady repeated to me like the same story 3 times. I understand why.
Yeah,
The caregivers of the organization were fantastic, but I can only imagine that some people will not understand and not be as patient, as
yeah.
kind, and, you know, giving, overcoming these issues that does not change who she was. She,
Not in the least.
right?
Not in the least. And there's similarly, and I say this respectfully because it's not an easy thing. Um, when my grandmother forgot my name, I didn't take it as a serious problem. I mean, she forgot my name, but I still felt that she kind of sensed who I was. And there were these moments of unexpected lucidity where she could actually call me Stevie.
Mm.
And so for me, uh, we put too much weight on these kinds of everyday expressions of communicative presence and memory. It doesn't matter much. I mean, what matters is love. And you can love someone who's deeply forgetful, and you can be loved by someone who's deeply forgetful, because
Yes,
love, there's this passage in the writings of St. Paul: nothing can separate us from the love of God,
that's beautiful.
and not even deep forgetfulness, nothing. And so, I've known people with advanced dementia who were incredibly profound at a spiritual level. We've had workshops with their families. I know the story. I tell the story in the book of a
Mhm.
guy named Jim at a nursing home called Heather Hill in the town of Chardon, Ohio.
Mm.
And I went to visit him with Joe Foley, and we read a little bio sketch on his wall. It talked about he'd been an accountant and he had 2 sons and what their names were. And so Joe and I went into the main area where these people with dementia were ambulating. And it's people who were pretty far along. And we asked the nurse, "Can you show us to Jim?" And so she introduced me to Jim. And we spoke with him just like we expected a response,
Mhm.
just because that's what you do. And you never know if you'll get one or not. He didn't respond, but I guided him over to the table and we sat down. And I said, "Jim, how are your 2 sons?" He got anxious, and I realized, aha, I didn't use language rightly. It's a lot about using language in this book at the end, especially. I should have said, "How's Jake?" And when I did that, he lit up because I was reminding him of his son. And then, "How's Luke?" Same thing. So you use language to cue people and give them hints of things so they're not constantly stressed out and trying to remember words that are difficult for them. So that helped. And he began to light up a little bit. And then he had a twig in his hands, just about this long. And it was just a white, thick twig. And the ends were rounded off. It was painted. And he put it in my hands. He just put it right in my hands. And and he smiled. And if I mean, that was like one of the biggest smiles I've ever seen. It was, a full smile. And it was so warm and touching. And so then I gave him back his twig. And a little later, I asked the nurse, "Tell me about Jim's twig." This is symbolic rationality, by the way. Um, well, he grew up on this farm, and his father was a Christian and a very kind man. And he'd gone back in time, as most of these people will do, to that sort of period that he most associated with tender, loving care. Turns out his dad gave him a chore every morning on the farm, which was to bring kindling in for the fireplace. So he had gone, that symbol that he put in my hands was a symbol of love for him. And then he said 3 words, and just 3 words. And that was it. He said, God is love. And I never forgot that. Joe Foley, who was like one of the world's most famous neurologists, was right there with me. He never forgot that. It just shows you that this guy, he died like, 3 or 4 months later. He was not conversant. He was pretty far, quote unquote, gone. But on a spiritual level, he was there. And so, like I say, nothing can separate us from the love of God. I mean, if you believe in an all-loving God, then that ultimate reality, that being, can figure out a way to be present, mystically present, in the heart and soul of anybody, whatever their circumstances.
Wow. That changes.
Don't you believe that?
Oh, I am certain of it. And hearing you say it, it's a different story because you come from a perspective of years of research, experience. And I think that's what the world needs, a new paradigm for life and for healthcare in general. Dr. Post, I'm keeping an eye on time because I
Okay.
know you have your commitment at 1 p.m. But I know you said the most beautiful message. I want to remind people that if they want more, go to stephengpost.com. But I'd like just one final comment from you before we let you go.
Well, Vanessa, it's always so much fun to be with you. I truly mean that. I remember when we met in Washington, D.C. at that meeting. It was so wonderful.
Yeah.
I'll give you my favorite quote,
Yes.
which comes from Eleanor Roosevelt. I may have spoken of this before. She said, "The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams." And despite all of this pandemic stuff, I've been here in this hospital all through it every day, consulting, doing all kinds of things. And I've been fine, didn't get sick myself, but a lot of people did. And interacted with a lot of family members of people who had dementia secondary to, say, Parkinson's or whatever,
Yeah.
who were wondering about medical ethical decisions. But I have to tell you that, I'm a dreamer, and the world needs dreamers. And everybody listening to this program, you're a dreamer, and you can use your gifts, whatever your age. You can use your gifts to contribute to the lives of others, and there's nothing that can prevent that. So, blessings, and just go forward with confidence.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Post. We wish you many blessings in your mission.
Okay, thank
And
you.
it was a joy to be with you. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. And hello to all the spiritualists out there in spiritual terms.
All right.
Kardec Radio.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Post. So, dear friends, you heard him, right? There's so much to read, to research. Go to stephengpost.com. See how we get to understand life more than we could imagine. Dr. Post is a missionary scientist on Earth. He has written books that are helping people in so many ways. Of all the books, we would say Why Good Things Happen to Good People is one of the ones we would recommend to you. And the other one, especially if you are a caregiver, Dignity for the Deeply Forgetful. It's like a manual for those who are taking care of people in such conditions. So we hope you have enjoyed it. We hope you have realized that there is so much to this world. And you see, this is happening in America to show to you that there is much good happening around. Stay tuned for more, because Blessed America will continue bringing extraordinary thinkers, researchers to our conversation. And should you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, write to us at kardecradio@gmail.com. For now, we wish you many blessings, yes, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
We hope you have enjoyed our program. Spread the word, Kardec Radio, to learn more about Spiritism.